introductions. I'm going to share my slides with you all. So my name is Jessica Newsome. I'm the Director of Behavioral Health at Alternatives, and I'm going to turn it over to Bessie to introduce herself as well.
Hi, I'm Bessie. I'm the Executive Director at Alternatives, pronouns she, her.
And today we're talking about structural support for racial equity. So we have a racial equity plan that is structural for the organization. We're going to get into that in just a couple minutes, but we also have been doing trainings on the racial equity plan itself, and that's part of what we'd like to get all of your feedback on today. So typically when we train on this, we talk about moving past a general idea of racial equity into practical planning, identifying action at your organization, and understanding how to find rationale behind racial equity practices. And so that's typically the grounding that we would give for the context of this work. Another piece of context that we typically give when we are presenting is that this work is not meant to be an anti-oppression 101. So we don't spend time defining terms. We assume that people have done enough internal work to engage in conversations respectfully and with intention towards dismantling white supremacy. I bring this statement in as well because this is another piece that I would love feedback on. I think there is quite a bit of anti-oppression 101 work out there that's doing really good work, and we're trying to figure out how to build on that in a structural way. So we want to make sure that people who are participating in our workshops understand that context as well. Our racial equity plan is something that we developed internally at the organization, starting with the leadership of Bessie as executive director. Historically, the organization had been led by a white executive director who'd been essentially a founder and was with the organization for 38 years. When Bessie took over, one of the pieces that she brought, or the lenses and framework that she brought, was to look at everything from the perspective of equity. And so the purpose of our racial equity plan is to eliminate racial inequities, both internally and externally. So thinking not just about how do we use our programs and services to eliminate racial inequities, but also how do we make sure that we are not perpetuating those inequities internally at the organization. We also want to improve outcomes for BIPOC board, leadership staff, and the young people that we serve. Implement structural changes to ensure that racial equity is reflected in our processes, not just our programs and services. To build guidelines and frameworks for how to design and implement social and systemic change, and to update external stakeholders on what we're doing and why, to make sure that we're centering values of transparency and collaboration. So that's the broad strokes overview, and I'm going to turn it over to Bessie to give you a little bit more in-depth insight into what the racial equity plan has in itself.
So as of right now, as it stands, our racial equity plan has more than 30 goals and more than 200 action steps in all of these areas, from administration to advocacy. And a couple of things in how we constructed our racial equity plan that I think is important. Common mistakes that we see when we're talking to other organizations about racial equity is that they stop just at representation and diversity. They may do some anti-racism training with their staff, or they have their racial equity plan as being under the one diversity and inclusion officer. And, you know, the thing about this is it's that in order for it to be successful, it needs to be embedded in all of the work that you do, right? And buy-in from the head of the organization all the way down, everybody has to do the work to understand. And so when we talk about structural support, if we're not talking about just representation and training, then what are we talking about, right? That's how we get to these 200 action steps. And so one of the things for us that I think is really quick to talk about, for example, was the implementation of a livable wage became a huge part of our conversation. And so why is a livable wage important? if we're hiring, particularly if we're talking about representation and hiring people from our communities, we also have to understand the historical oppression that has gone into Black and Brown communities. So we may not have the same rates of education, the same access to professional opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. And so what has typically happened is if somebody has a high school diploma, does not have the same level of work experience, then they may be paid a lower wage. And I think we can all agree that the minimum wage by state is not necessarily the same thing as a livable wage, right? And so what happens when you're increasing representation a lot of times, especially on the front lines, you're increasing it, but you're also by design upholding these inequities, right? And so if we have somebody who's in full-time employment, how do we set them up to not just survive, but also thrive so that they don't need to get a second job just to make ends meet? And that's where the livable wage comes in. And that's where the impact on populations of color. And so that became a really hot topic as well. And another thing to know about the racial equity plan is every time we started going down one path, we uncovered a million other steps that we needed to do to truly be equitable. And so one of the things that Jessica and I were talking about was if you find that you accomplish one thing, but 10 other things crop up in its place, then you're probably doing it right. Because it just means that you've gone down the rabbit hole of how just unjust our system is set up and trying to tackle all of those things. And so with the livable wage, when you start talking about that, you're also talking about unnecessary educational requirements, other in workplace practices such as paying for benefits. How do you recruit? What kind of questions? And so it just becomes, and that's how you get to 200 action steps, basically.
Thank you, Bessie. So then the last step that we have in the workshop around racial equity action planning is to take some of the steps that people have heard and have people apply that knowledge and learning to their own organization with a series of questions about different action steps. So you all heard Bessie talk about the livable wage, and there's other items as well that can be brought into this action planning stage, such as looking at funders and what their practices are, if they've made statements about their support for anti-oppressive work or racial equity work, things like that. And going through these questions helps to create more of a concrete plan rather than a lofty idea. So thinking about who would be involved in creating that change or that process internally at the organization, asking when are you going to meet with them next? Sometimes there's a natural meeting to bring that idea to. Sometimes you have to set that meeting up intentionally. Asking how can you engage in a conversation with that person or that stakeholder around making this change or process happen, and what is a reasonable time frame to expect the change or process to be complete. As Bessie named to you, we had 30 goals and over 30 goals and over 200 action steps under those goals. Each of those have a different time frame, and some are things that we can accomplish quickly and with little process needed to make the change, and others are going to take years to implement. And so thinking about how to start, but also how to continue the work in a reasonable time frame. That's the end of the overview. I want to thank you, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen now to turn it over to you all for feedback and questions.
One thing that we didn't talk about is the idea too, as you're doing an equity plan, about external accountability or internal accountability. And so one of the things that we've done with our equity plan is that it's an internal document that is open to all of our staff so they can see in real time what progress we've made access to the logic, what articles that we're reading about it, what logic we used. All of that is in there. And so that allows for this constant communication in case we miss something as a leadership team.
Yeah, absolutely. We also do go over the plan as part of orientation and invite all new staff to provide feedback and give insight and ideas as a part of their orientation. There's a question in the chat, Bessie. Do you want me to read it to you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. With so many priorities, how did you narrow down? Because everything can't be a priority or nothing is. Do you have a change management plan with time horizons for implementation?
Yeah. So for us, what that's looked like is that we've been pulling out a couple of priorities by year in which we're doing it based on what we see as most urgent, which is typically led by staff and young people. And so one of the big thing that we heard last year was the livable wage and how to make that happen. So that became a huge project in last year, how to make that happen. And then this year, the big thing that keeps resurfacing is a leadership pipeline for people of color, specifically because historically we do not have the same access to networks and mentors that our white colleagues do. And so that's a thing that they've been asking for. So that's going to be our focus for this year. So we typically pick about 3 to 4 major projects, and that's what we work on.
And the next question is, what response have you gotten to the plan, and did you receive it?
We have not gotten pushback. We've gotten a lot of curiosity when somebody doesn't necessarily understand why we're doing something. So for example, we got rid of, if a job is a job and it doesn't require a degree, we got rid of the degree requirement. But we also got rid of the disparity in pay for a degree versus a non-degree, unless we have to require you to have a degree. And so what I mean by that is, for example, our RJ work doesn't require a degree, so everybody just makes the same amount. But on the BH side, we have to require a master's. So they make slightly more because we have to require a master's legally. And so some of our staff, especially our staff of color, didn't necessarily like that because they felt like they were punished for having a degree. And so we just spent some time. But they didn't approach it from a pushback. They wanted to understand why we did that. So we explained how higher education has historically limited access to people of color. And once they got that, they were like, that makes sense. And so it's been more conversations than actual pushback. Yes, thank you, restorative justice. So that's but we've had to spend a lot of time on the conversations, and that's why the context has been really important. From an external standpoint, I do want to add that the feedback has been pretty positive. And we integrated our racial equity plan into our strategic plan. We actually redid our mission and our values to incorporate our racial equity work. And so we're really taking this approach of embedding it into everything that we do. And we've noticed that funders and partners and even potential employees are letting us know that they're coming to work with us because of our values. And so I think that's extremely important. Yeah, so I would actually say that fundraising is the bigger challenge. Fundraising, because of the external requirements, and philanthropy is still about 90% white. And so it's a challenge because of the power dynamics of we ask for money and they give it to us when they like us, right? there is a power dynamic at play that makes it difficult to educate our funders when they're being problematic without necessarily losing our funding. We have lost our funding in this process, some funding in the process. I think that's more challenging for us from a values perspective. And what does that mean? From an actual task perspective, most interestingly enough, most of the action steps are coming out of are for HR specifically, because so many of what we understand to be good business practices are rooted in capitalism and white supremacy. And so when like I said, once you start going down that rabbit hole, you find out how much about what we think professional means is rooted in practices that are meant to exclude people of color. And so that's where most of the action items are coming from. And the biggest challenge, honestly, is just time to do all of it, because it's the charge of every single person in the agency, not just a diversity and inclusion officer. It's, all of us managing our regular jobs while trying to, for example, update a job description to make sure it reflects these values, or before we post it, or redoing our interview process to make sure it doesn't naturally pull out, set up white people for success. And so it's just this constant lens that we have to have.
Last question is, can you speak more to restorative justice process, and are there any resources you can recommend? That's an area this.
Resources. Jessica, does anything pop out to you? I kind of feel like.
It's interesting because this is a core program of the organization, and so it's something that we have been working with young people in Chicago public schools since the early 90s on, and so it's definitely something that I think we've just had a lot of internal resources around, but there are a number of trainings and resources and things like that to help people get started. I think the most important thing is really engaging in it with a practitioner who has that depth of knowledge and technical learnings in the field. So that would be my recommendation there. Last
I
question.
See the question. Yeah, the question from Nancy. So we specifically screen for values and base knowledge and racial equity. If you jump on our website, you will see that our mission statement, one of the foundational points of equity is addressing systems, not just individual responsibility. And so our mission statement reflects that. One of our values is liberation, which tells our potential population what is a bit about ourselves. We have some of our advocacy on our site, so you can see that we have a cops-free school stance, a fair tax stance. If you follow our social media, you can see we have a defund the police stance. So that, I think, automatically will attract a certain type of employee. And then I think, Jessica, you can talk a little bit more about some of the screening questions that we ask.
Yeah, so in terms of screening questions, one of the ones we'll ask is that, the organization centers restorative justice practices as part of not only our services, but also how we operate internally. And so asking the person, the applicant or candidate, how would you be an ambassador for those values to people who disagree is a good one to ask. We do the same thing with our Cops Out CPS. This is a value for the organization. How would you be an ambassador for people who disagree? And so that's something that just helps gauge two different things. One, how does this person engage with different opinions? And then second, how do they engage with the value itself as a representative of the organization, or how would they? Great. So we are at time. Thank you so much. And we appreciate all of your questions.